What would it take to undo years of indoctrination? A speech, a book, or a single taste? Picture this. You're marched into a camp in 1943, certain you will be punished and starved. A bottle hisses open. A spoon sinks into something cold and sweet. Would you trust it or rethink everything? Tell me in the comments, would one sip change your mind? Summer 1943, Camp Crossville, Tennessee. A German soldier who had crossed dunes and storms stared at a glass bottle he had never seen. The liquid was brown and full of tiny rising bubbles. He had lived on dry biscuits and ersatz coffee across North Africa, counting calories like treasure. Here, the guard said, a nickel buys this drink, the same nickel a child uses with an allowance. He turned the cap. The hiss felt like a secret released. The first swallow was sweet, cold, and alive. It tasted like a life he had been told did not exist. Across that summer, more than 371,000 prisoners would face the same surprise. They had been warned that America was soft and disorganized. They found a country where ice cream was routine, soft drinks were daily, and candy bars were so common guards sometimes handed them out to keep the line moving. These small things, sugar, fizz, cream, did more than comfort. They measured a system. They showed math in flavors, supply chains, standardization, and scale. What had felt like noble deprivation began to look like needless suffering. The lesson wasn't shouted, it was served. The Desert Campaign ended with the surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. Veterans who had once pushed toward Egypt expected hard treatment. They had heard they would be broken by hunger. Instead, the first American field rations opened like a puzzle of small luxuries: crackers, processed cheese, candy, fruit bars, instant coffee, sugar tablets, cigarettes. American troops joked about these rations. Prisoners treated them as feasts. In processing points in North Africa, pancakes appeared, syrup, eggs, milk, foods that had vanished from their lives years earlier. The policy was simple and quiet. Feed them well right away. No lectures, just breakfast. One officer later told a relief worker, "We expected to be starved. Instead, we were fed better than our own army." He didn't say this with joy. He said it with confusion. That confusion was the first crack in a wall that had taken years to build. The crack widened at sea. Liberty ships carried prisoners toward a continent they had been told was decadent and weak. The vessels were miracles of repetition, built fast, built alike, built to move mountains. Below decks, refrigeration hummed. Bread arrived warm. Meat and vegetables reached the tables in full portions. The coffee came with sugar and milk, a sign of resources, not just taste. Logs recorded daily calories that matched or even exceeded what crew received. Numbers matter at sea. So do rituals. On the 4th of July, on more than one ship, someone rolled out an ice cream maker. 10 gallons a batch. A holiday on the ocean. The men watched a churn spin and thought, this cannot be real. The ship docked. The shock did not end. Ports like Norfolk and Newport News looked like cities designed for movement. Warehouses breathed. Rail lines curved like ink. The base at Norfolk covered miles. It handled more cargo in a day than some European ports could manage in a week. And at the exchanges, where dock workers shopped between shifts, shelves stood in perfect rows. Hershey, Mars, Nestle, rows of bars for 5 cents, the same price as anywhere else. No special window, no permission stamp, just a coin and a hand. The journey inland added new chapters to this lesson. The men did not board cattle cars. They stepped into passenger coaches. Windows open to fields and towns. Dining cars offered printed menus, fried chicken, vegetables, pie. Coffee poured again. They were told this wasn't a show. This was normal American rail service. Back home, privilege controlled the menu. Here, a ticket controlled the meal. Camp Crossville, like many camps, was built to meet and often exceed the Geneva rules. Electric lights flicked on at night. Hot water ran. The barracks were heated. None of this was luxury, only evidence of a baseline. But the exchange, the PX, was where the real lesson repeated every day. The work program paid wages. First, 80 cents. Later, $1. At 5 cents a soda and 5 cents a candy bar, a single day's pay bought a small mountain of sweetness. Ice cream cost 10 cents for a bar or a sandwich. In camps with refrigeration, tubs appeared in summer. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, and, later, flavors that felt almost unreal to men who hadn't seen a parlor in years. Sugar sat in bowls on mess hall tables, not measured into tiny envelopes. Bowls! You could take a spoon and decide how sweet your coffee should be. The quartermaster sent 100-pound bags to camp kitchens week after week. Cakes and cookies came out of ovens like clockwork. Someone tried to use sugar on a humid day and found it had hardened. The kitchen staff chose speed over recovery. They tossed it and ordered more. The prisoners who worked there stood still, jars in hand, trying to process what it meant. One man whispered, "In our town, they would have softened it. Here, they replace it." He wasn't angry. He was learning. The lesson felt simple. A country that can afford to waste a little sugar can afford to choose mercy. Every small item, the nickel bottle, the bowl of sugar, the ice in July, pointed to the same thing, a system that delivered consistency across distance. And one brand signaled that system better than any speech. A drink with a name that tasted the same no matter where you stood. But that wasn't the whole story. The real shock would be how far that sameness could reach, and how it would turn doubt into agreement, one identical sip at a time.
The sameness of that first sip was not a trick of memory. It was a system. The syrup came from one source, then moved to bottlers across the country. The taste matched in Maine and in Texas because it was designed to match. 5 cents here, 5 cents there. A promise kept by machinery, schedules, and trained hands. Work details noticed the pattern in towns near the camps. Vending coolers stood in garages, in schools, in factory break rooms. A red sign, a crate of glass bottles, and the quiet message, "Anyone can have this." Records tell us the volume. Some camps received 200 to 300 cases in a single delivery, week after week. One Texas site drank roughly 7,000 bottles in a summer week. The number mattered less than the feeling. It meant that supply was not fragile. It meant that a coin at a moment of thirst had an answer almost everywhere. The part that shocked many was not only abundance, but indifference. Americans sipped while they worked. They set half-empty bottles down and forgot them. A guard would clear a table and toss a sticky bottle into a bin without ceremony. A few prisoners kept the caps as tokens. Others wrote lines home describing a world where taste was casual and sweet things were common. The lesson was not about sugar. It was about reach. If a nation can make sameness feel normal, what else can it make feel certain? Ice cream offered the proof in a colder language. The military treated it as morale, not luxury. On ships and in camps, the churns kept turning when weather allowed. Logs describe holiday batches, 10 gallons at a time, spun on steel decks to mark the 4th of July. The sight was impossible to forget. Ocean wind, men in uniforms, and a frozen dessert handed across the line with a smile. If ice cream could live on a ship, it could live anywhere. On land, the story grew. In 1943, you could find hand-cranked tubs at summer events inside the wire. Ice, salt, cream, sugar. Simple tools, steady hands, and patience. By 1944, many sites had electric machines. Orders rose with the heat. Large camps brought in 50 to 100 gallons a week in peak months. The PX offered bars and sandwiches at 10 cents. Cups came in chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, sometimes butter pecan. Men who had not tasted a parlor scoop since youth sat quietly over paper cups and tried to name the flavor of relief. The shock of cold was its own memory, but the logistics behind it did the deeper work. Refrigerators hummed in kitchens. Deliveries arrived on time. Ice moved without drama. Dairy showed up because routes were stable and fuel was allocated for routine, not just emergencies. That steadiness taught a hidden lesson. Abundance is not a mood, it is a schedule kept. Chocolate traced the same arc. Factories in several states pushed out bars for both civilian shelves and military contracts. The military alone bought hundreds of millions of pounds across the war years. Camp exchanges stocked a spread. Plain bars, nut bars, caramel, wafer, the compact emergency blocks made for field kits. Prices sat in the same range everywhere, 5 to 10 cents. The shock here was not only volume, but preference. People had favorites and said so out loud. The power to say, "I like this one better," and act on it felt new. Choice crept into daily life like a quiet hymn. A prisoner could stand at a counter, look at 5 options, and pick one based on mood. He might even change his mind the next day. No form, no shortage list, no lecture about sacrifice. The right to choose a sweet was small, but it was visible, and it repeated. Choice trained the eye to see lines connecting farms, factories, rail cars, depots, and the last mile to a shelf. The mess halls sealed the lesson in routine. Coffee was poured with milk and sugar because both were available as a matter of policy. Bowls of sugar sat out again and again. Cakes appeared after meals often enough to feel ordinary. In one humid week, when several sacks hardened, the staff discarded the lumpy sugar and moved on. A few men stared at the trash bin, then at the new sacks. Waste did not signal cruelty here. It signaled confidence in tomorrow's delivery. Not every surprise came in a kitchen. On work details outside the wire, prisoners began to witness the front end of the chain. Orchards heavy with fruit, dairy trucks on early routes, the line of tankers near a bottling plant. Even the air near a canning operation told a story. Sweet, metallic, constant. Blemished fruit rolled to a side chute for animal feed because the main line accepted only one shape, one size, one shine. Quality control looked like discipline, but it also looked like wealth, the power to say no in service of a larger yes. Numbers appeared in newspapers and on bulletin boards. Production tallies were not secrets. Soft drinks measured in billions of bottles. Ice cream counted in hundreds of millions of gallons. Milk by the river of it. Sugar by the mountain. The openness felt as strange as the scale. Facts were not guarded. They were printed so that a grocer, a student, and a soldier could read the same line at breakfast. Even the price of a nickel began to change meaning. In some countries, a coin buys status. Here, it bought sameness. A child with an allowance, a machinist at lunch, a guard after shift, a prisoner with wages from camp work, all could hand over the same coin for the same product. The experience was democratic in the smallest possible way, a shared taste delivered on time. And still more was coming. The holidays would turn routine into ritual. Neighbors from nearby towns would carry kindness through the gates, and a quiet reversal would unfold, packages crossing the ocean in the other direction carried by men who once expected nothing but hunger. But that wasn't the whole story. The greatest test would come when these lessons met the numbers of ration books and the glow of newsreels and the long walk home. Holidays turned routine into ritual. On the 4th of July, camp courtyards filled with music from a borrowed radio. Someone rolled out a hand-cranked freezer. Ice and salt hissed against the metal canister, while cream and sugar thickened into something cold and joyful. Men lined up, quiet at first. The first spoonful loosened shoulders. Laughter rose. A guard said, "Another scoop," and meant it. A frozen dessert became a lesson. Morale is policy here, not a rare favor. Thanksgiving lifted that feeling onto a national stage. Across the system, the menu matched. Roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes and gravy, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pumpkin pie, coffee, and milk. The effort reached from warehouses to ovens to plates, the same day, the same meal. It told a simple truth: organization beats shortage. It also whispered something deeper. Fair treatment was not a performance for visitors, it was a standard. December added neighbors to the story. Civic groups sent parcels. Church committees baked cookies and wrapped them with care. Writing paper, toiletries, small games, candy canes. In several towns near large camps, people drove up with tins of homemade treats and left them at the gate. Some had sons overseas. Some had lost family. They brought kindness anyway. The gesture felt impossible to those who received it. It also felt undeniable. Strength, they learned, could look like generosity. Work details outside the wire turned the map of abundance into a map of places. In orchards, ladders leaned into trees heavy with cherries bound for garnish jars, bright dots meant to sit on top of sundaes. The volume shocked men who had once scraped crumbs from plates. At canneries, belts carried fruit past sharp eyes. Anything irregular shifted to a side chute. Edible, yes, but not the right size for a label. The rejected bins went to feed animals or to secondary uses. Quality here was part pride and part process. It set a standard people could trust. Sugar beet fields in the Midwest offered a different kind of wonder. Machines moved in wide rows. Single farms filled rail cars. Trucks delivered beets to plants where engineers turned roots into crystal by the ton. The lesson was not just machinery, it was the cadence: plant, harvest, process, ship, repeat. When rhythm is steady, sweetness flows. Schoolyards taught with even softer pictures. Early lunch programs set out steaming trays. Children drank milk every day. Bottles clinked in crates by the door. The drivers knew the route by heart. In some cafeterias, a small counter sold ice cream after the main meal. A child would place a coin, choose a flavor, and walk away grinning. Watching that scene, several men felt the ground shift under old beliefs. If the youngest citizens could count on nourishment at noon, what else could they count on? Diners revealed another quiet principle. A counter, a row of stools, a chalkboard menu. A factory worker and a bank manager sat elbow to elbow and ordered the same plate. A hamburger cost a quarter, a soda a nickel, a slice of pie 15 cents, a full dinner special well under $1. The cook called out orders with the same voice for everyone. No titles, no special line. The rule was plain: if you can pay, you can choose. Equality lived in the price list. Back inside the camps, the PX kept hours like any shop in any town. Shelves reset every morning. Soft drinks in coolers, candy in rows, tobacco on one side, fruit when available, ice cream in summer if the machines were humming. The clerk counted coins and wrote down orders for the next delivery. Wages from labor made the small purchases feel earned, not granted. That mattered. Pride returned in tiny steps, guided by nickels and dimes. Then came the reversal no one had expected at the start of captivity. Parcels began to flow the other way. Men saved wages and bought what would matter most at home. Chocolate bars, instant coffee, canned goods, small comforts that could survive the trip. Through international channels, packages crossed oceans. Families opened boxes and found American brands they had only heard about. Letters followed saying, "We tasted what you sent." A prisoner sending food to relatives became living proof that the map of plenty had flipped. Numbers drifted into daily talk without fanfare. Soft drink output counted by the billion bottles each year, ice cream by the vast sweet gallon, milk by the 100 billion measure, sugar by mountains. These weren't secrets. You could read them in a paper at breakfast. Transparency worked like a second kind of abundance. Information was free because supply was steady. The small moments never lost their power. A guard offering an extra scoop on a hot day. A kitchen worker folding sugar into cake batter without checking a ledger. A child waving with a milk bottle in hand. Each scene pressed the same point. Here, the system tries to make normal life resilient. Here, daily comfort is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of design. Of course, not everything felt simple. Men wrestled with old lessons and new facts. Some held back, waiting for the mask to slip. It did not. Weeks turned to months, and the pattern held. Meals, PX hours, deliveries, wages, work details, rest, holidays, letters, parcels. The routine did the work speeches could not do. What happens when routine becomes evidence? When the taste of a nickel drink and the weight of a care package home carry more force than 1,000 slogans? The answer was arriving in theaters and mess halls soon, flickering on screens and printed in ledgers the whole country could read. But that wasn't the whole story. The next test would pit feelings against figures, ration books against receipts, newsreels against memories, and set the stage for what these men would carry back across the ocean.
Figures arrived that matched the taste on the tongue. Newspapers printed totals that once sounded like fiction. Sugar measured in the millions of tons yearly. Chocolate and cocoa products for the services counted in the hundreds of millions of pounds. A single soda brand reported billions of bottles in 1 year. Ice cream production passed 500 million gallons. Milk tallies reached into the hundreds of billions by official measures. These numbers were not whispered, they were public, checked, repeated. Abundance did not hide, it documented itself. Ration books told another truth. Americans lived with coupons and limits, but even then the baseline stayed high. Sugar allowances here still outpaced what civilians in Germany received when supplies even arrived. Meat per person per week in the States often exceeded what families in Europe saw in a month. People grumbled, of course they did, but the shelves kept filling. Lines moved, cafes stayed open. The complaint itself hinted at a deeper comfort. There was something to complain about because there was something to share. For POWs, that contrast settled in quietly. Morning coffee with milk and sugar, a steady main course, a dessert on ordinary days, not just holidays. The PX open on time, wages paid for labor. The pattern ran without drama, and because it ran without drama, it felt trustworthy. Routine became proof. Then came the flicker of film. Newsreels rolled in mess halls, theaters, and temporary auditoriums. On screen, soldiers walked through ruined streets and handed chocolate and gum to children who stared with tired eyes and then smiled like it hurt. The gesture was small. The meaning was not. It said, "We can be fierce and still share." In other reels, troops opened ration tins and passed them to people at the edge of survival. The camera did not linger on suffering. It lingered on hands offering help in the middle of wreckage.
Watching those frames, POWs felt the gap between slogans and scenes widen until it could not be crossed. By late 1945 and into 1946, the long return began. Many men stepped onto platforms with more weight than when they had been captured. Medical notes recorded simple facts. 3 meals a day make a body stronger. They carried final parcels home, coffee, chocolate, canned goods, and placed them on kitchen tables where families had learned to count crumbs. Children who had forgotten sweetness peeled the paper from a bar and tasted a future. That moment said what no lecture could. The world could be rebuilt into something generous. Letters and interviews from the years after captivity spoke with a new vocabulary. Men wrote about production, not plunder, about schedules, not slogans, about standardization as a kind of promise. They had watched a drink taste the same across a continent. They had seen a school milk line run like clockwork. They had learned that quality control, even the waste that offended them at first, was part of safeguarding trust in the product and the system behind it. When aid proposals for rebuilding Europe appeared, many former POWs supported them for a simple reason. They had learned that wealth grows by making, not by taking. They believed a repaired market would feed a repaired politics. They had seen a country strong enough to offer ice cream to enemies and confident enough to send cargo ships full of grain, machines, and hope. Abundance, they argued, was not zero-sum. It multiplied when more people could buy and sell and choose. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, that belief took shape, on streets and in shops. The cola returned to West Germany with its bright logo and precise taste. New parlors sold sundaes with whipped cream and a cherry that glowed like a small beacon in a glass bowl. Grocery stores reorganized into something new. Wider aisles, standard packages, shelves where customers picked up goods themselves and paid at the end. Supermarkets turned distribution into a daily spectacle. Choice moved from counters to carts. Former prisoners stood in those aisles and recognized a pattern. The same bottle, the same bar, the same carton. Predictable quality made prices fair and decisions easy. They applied those lessons at work. In factories, they pushed for processes that favored consistency. In businesses, they argued for logistics that hit the same mark every time. In communities, they backed systems that fed schools and protected consumer confidence. The philosophy was simple. When ordinary people can count on ordinary goods, extraordinary stability follows. Some turned memory into trade. Importers brought in candies and soft drinks they had first tried behind wire. Cafes copied American soda fountains with stools, chrome, and a menu that felt like a promise kept. Industrial designers and managers studied packaging, bottling, and cold chains. They taught teams that the last mile, the shelf, the cooler, the counter, was as important as the first mile in a field or a plant. Abundance depended on every mile. Personal testimonies kept circling back to small moments. "My first cola felt like drinking the future," one man told a journalist. Another said, "The sundae wasn't necessary, and that was the point. We learned what it means when a society can offer something unnecessary to anyone for a coin." A factory foreman explained it this way: standardization is respect. It says, "We won't waste your time with surprise." The words varied, but the message stayed constant. Sweetness carried a lesson. Even statistics felt less abstract because they had been tasted. Billions of bottles were not just ink on a page, they were lines of coolers that the men had walked past. Hundreds of millions of gallons of ice cream were not just a number, they were the memory of a spoon cutting into a white drift on a hot day. Milk, measured by the astonishing figure, was not just an economic fact. It was a child raising a bottle in a school hall and smiling with a white mustache. The return home did not erase loss. Cities lay in ash, families were changed forever. Scarcity lingered. Yet the men who had lived inside the American system of plenty brought back a map. How production, logistics, and choice could stack to create not just comfort, but confidence. They taught that abundance is a civic project, not a private miracle. And still, there was one more turn. The lesson that began with a nickel bottle and a paper cup would crystallize into a quiet creed. Freedom tastes like options, and options require trust. Trust, in turn, requires the humility to keep the schedule, the courage to keep the standard, and the grace to share with even those who once stood across from you. But that wasn't the whole story. One final scene remained. The moment when a humble Sunday, layer by layer, became a blueprint for a new life, and a father set a chocolate bar on a kitchen table and said, "This is how the future will feel."
The last scene begins at a kitchen table. A man home from captivity places a wrapped bar in front of a child who has only known shortages. Paper crackles. The first bite lands with silence, then a smile that feels like sunrise. No speech can do what that square of chocolate does. It says, "The world can be sweet again," and the sweetness does not have to be rare. Many families heard the same quiet report from returning fathers. The stories were simple. A bottle that hissed the same in every town, a scoop that showed up even at sea, a sugar bowl that never ran dry. The details were ordinary, and therefore astonishing. The lesson kept repeating. Confidence lives in schedules, not slogans. When a society chooses to keep promises about little things, the big things become possible. In the years that followed, streets changed. Storefront windows widened. Shelves held the same products week after week. Soda fountains returned with chrome and stools, serving sundaes that made a ceremony out of everyday joy. Markets turned into supermarkets. Carts replaced counters. Labels matched their contents. And beneath it all, a quiet code spread through workshops and offices. Keep the standard, then raise it. Keep the schedule, then shorten it. Share the gain. What once felt like luxury became a measure of trust. A nickel could buy a drink that tasted like memory. A coin could buy a scoop that tasted like a promise. Parents taught children the small rituals: bottle, straw, clink of ice. Dish, spoon, cherry on top. And the rituals taught the children something larger. Abundance is not accident. It is effort, repeated until it feels like air. Former POWs carried their maps of plenty into work. Some managed bottling lines, where valves and gauges held flavor within a precise range. Some ran warehouses, where packages moved like clock hands. Some opened cafes, where anyone with a few coins could sit down and take their time. They trained teams to see quality as respect, a consistent taste, a fair price, a friendly counter. These were not extras. They were the ground on which trust could grow. The lesson also flowed into public life. If a school can guarantee milk, it can guarantee books. If a town can run a cold chain, it can run a clinic. If a nation can make ice cream for troops and for former enemies, it can build bridges, power plants, and futures without saying that someone else must lose for us to win. Abundance invited a wider circle. The circle, once widened, resisted shrinking. Decades later, the echoes remained. A traveler sipped a cola in a different country and smiled at the sameness. A grandparent told a child about a day when the ocean wind blew across a ship's deck and a churn turned cream into celebration. The child listened and then looked around a supermarket where aisles seemed to stretch into tomorrow. What had sounded like legend became normal life. The miracle had become method. Historians would write about figures and policies and plans. Those matter. But the people who lived the change often framed it in flavor. "My first sip tasted like permission," one remembered. "Permission to imagine more." Another said, "The Sunday taught me this. We can layer good things and share them, and there will still be more tomorrow." Their language was simple because the proof had been simple. A spoon, a bottle, a line that moved. Even the smallest memories held weight. The clink of a cap on a counter. The soft collapse of whipped cream under a cherry. The scrape of a spoon against a paper cup on a hot day. The quiet gasp when a sugar bowl landed on a cable and stayed there. Each sound and texture added a stitch to a fabric that outlasted speeches. Abundance trained the senses to expect fairness. Fairness trained the heart to trust what it once feared. Return trips to America by the next generation confirmed the story. Airports flowed. Highways linked places like sentences in a book. Cafes poured drinks that tasted like home to people who had never lived there. Aisles offered choice without ceremony. In that choice, visitors recognized the same idea their parents had carried: prosperity that multiplies when more people can participate. None of this erased pain. The war had carved deep lines. Cities bore scars. Families carried losses that no supply chain could replace. Yet the men who tasted plenty in captivity had learned to read a different map. It pointed toward a future drawn not by conquest, but by creation. Make more, share more, trust more. Those three lines guided a rebuilding that turned scarcity into stability and later into confidence. And so we return to that Sunday resting on a counter, the blueprint in a bowl. The base is simple nourishment. The next layer is skill and process. Syrup is creativity. Whipped cream is generosity without calculation. The cherry is a promise kept for no other reason than that it lifts the spirit. Put a spoon in and you understand the argument without hearing it. A free society proves itself by making goodness boring and kindness routine. The bottle tells its own version. Cold glass, paper label, carbonation snapping against the tongue. A taste that refuses to surprise you in the best possible way. It is not just a drink. It is a contract offered daily. We will be the same today as we were yesterday, and that sameness will be good. For people raised to expect shortages and lectures, this quiet contract was radical. What began as amazement ended as conviction. Men who once marched under harsh instruction returned as witnesses to a different strength. They taught that a nation can be tough and still be tender, organized and still be open-handed. They taught that a steady supply of ordinary pleasures, milk at school, pie at dinner, a soda at noon, a scoop at night, can change how people think about one another more than any demand ever could. If you listen closely, you can still hear the camp radio crackle, the churn turn, the cap hiss. You can still see a sugar bowl land on a table with a soft thud. These are small sounds, but together they mark the beat of a new belief, that dignity grows where people can count on daily good things, and that mercy backed by production can move mountains no speech can budge. So the story ends where it began, with a simple taste in a hot summer. A bottle lifted, a spoon raised, surprise turning into trust. The lesson travels well. Generosity is not weakness. It is capacity with an open hand. And sometimes the sharpest turn in a life comes not from a shouted command, but from a calm voice saying, "Another scoop?" If the nickel could reframe a worldview, what could your next small act do? Tell me in the comments. What everyday kindness changed your map of the world?